Well, thank you so much for being here. My name is Jess Segovia. My company is ADA Guru, and I do specialize in ADA compliance in all forms of transportation. Private side, but also public transportation, right? Fixed route, our dial-a-ride, ADA paratransit, human service transportation, etc. So we don't have a lot of time together. Typically, my ADA compliance trainings are 5 hours long. Right? We go into great detail and lots of examples. And so because we have a shorter period of time to work together today, I really wanted to structure this presentation a little differently to really go off of what your questions are. So instead of, I'll go through a few slides, but then I want to turn it over to you. And I want to hear what your challenges are. What incidents have you experienced lately? Where are you struggling when you're trying to assist people with disabilities? Or what part of the ADA is very difficult for you, your agency, etc., to interpret, right? I don't know if anyone's ever attempted to contact the FTA with an ADA-related question, but in my experience, and I've yet to hear a different response from anyone, their response is always directing you to the guidance, to the regulation, and then they want you to interpret it. And that is often very difficult for agencies. And so that's one of the things that I feel, and the opening comments were really appreciated, that it's acknowledged. I try to bring real world examples. I've been in your shoes. I've trained operators. I've driven out there when an operator is struggling and needs assistance, investigated ADA related complaints, right? Worked hand in hand with the public, secured wheelchairs, thousands of wheelchairs on buses, right? I understand, maybe some of you will have questions about odor, right? What do we do about body odor? Maybe some of you will have questions about service animals. This is that opportunity. I don't want anyone today to walk out of here without an answer to your question, okay? The ADA is very much about if this, then that. It's true. The vast majority of ADA-related trainings you go to, someone is throwing the regulation at you, and they're making it seem like the ADA is very inflexible. Well, the ADA is challenging and confusing because we have choices to make. There are a number of terms in the ADA that are not defined for us. One of these terms is to provide a reasonable level of assistance to people with disabilities. Well, what does that even mean? Right? A reasonable level of assistance. That could be one thing to me. That could be something else for each of you, right? Depending on the type of rider that we're working with and the type of disability that they have, right? And so that's what makes the ADA really challenging. I would say the ADA is also very challenging because we're worried about the outcome of something that has just happened. What is the rider going to do? Are they going to sue us? Are they going to file a complaint? I don't want any complaints, right? I think another thing we need to remember, especially for those operators out there, we need to remember that we can do everything correctly and they can still file a complaint against us because they might not like how we are operating. The ADA gives us choices, right? One of those choices is in fixed route bus service, wheelchair securement. We can have a policy that requires wheelchair securement. We can also have a policy, if we choose, to make wheelchair securement on our large fixed route traditional buses optional. I don't know if many of you know that. Some of you, it really started to become an issue during COVID when I was getting calls from agencies. What do we do? What do we do? We don't want our drivers to be in close contact with any of our riders. And I would tell them, well, we still have to comply with the ADA requirements, and that includes wheelchair securement, etc. And they asked for my advice, and I said, well, if you really want to reduce the number of incidences or times that a rider and a driver need to be in close proximity, make wheelchair securement on your fixed route buses optional. And they didn't like that idea because of safety concerns. But choices, right? What I gave them was a choice. I gave them knowledge to be able to make a different choice than they had been making in their operation. And so, they made those choices accordingly. I don't know that anyone actually took that up because they were worried about safety, etc. But I worked for, my last public agency was Los Angeles Metro in Los Angeles County, California. And Los Angeles Metro is a wheelchair securement optional system in fixed route. And so we did surveys and we looked at data, and only 25% of people boarding in wheelchairs chose securement. right? So even people with disabilities have choices. The ADA is full of choices for people with disabilities, and sometimes the choices that they make don't ensure their greatest level of safety. I think that proved it, right? In my experience at LA Metro, where only 25% of boardings were people in wheelchairs were secured. And so at the time, we were boarding 140,000 riders in wheelchairs a month. So that's, over 100,000, I think, of rides on our buses that were not secured. Rider choice. So it's really important to understand that. So when we're doing a great job with ADA compliance, we are ensuring that we're following the regulation, right? We're keeping our riders safe. We're delivering consistent service, and we are respecting their rights to do certain things and to not have to do certain things as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that. My trainings, the time we spend together today will only be as good as your experiences and sharing those experiences with everyone. Your questions, your comments. Someone might ask something and I might say, has anyone else dealt with that? How did you deal with it? What I'm hoping to hear, and I hear this a lot from my trainings, is every now and then someone will say, you know what, now I know how to better handle that situation the next time it happens. That's the best that I can hope for, right? To share the regulation, to answer your questions. We can walk through situations, right? Because it's if this, then that. A lot of what we deal with in the ADA has to do with that. So please ask questions at any time. Raise your hand, blurt it out, whatever works for you. Don't be afraid to go off topic, right? If you have any questions in general, I'll do my very best to answer them. And then if you've heard something different from another trainer in another session somewhere else, let's talk about that, right? Because when we talk about the ADA as having choices, right? Well, people can have different interpretations of things, right? And so that's how we can actually have some disagreement over perhaps what one of the regulations means or how we are supposed to apply it to our service. And I think if we do all of those things, we'll definitely have a good time in the next hour that we have together. We will talk about general assistance requirements, riders using wheelchairs. We have other riders with disabilities, right? We tend to think of ADA compliance and trips as people in wheelchairs, but no, the vast majority of our service is to people that are ambulatory, right? That are walking or maybe using a cane, a walker, etc. So, however, we do perhaps worry the most or spend the most time in training on assisting people using wheelchairs because wheelchair securement is difficult. It takes time to become an expert, right? And it's our responsibility that we do that. The ADA requires that we provide, that we ensure that our staff are trained to proficiency. That means that we need to train staff to be experts in the work that they do. And so all of you, raise your hand if you are a driver, operator. Okay, a number of you. If you are maybe supervisor, dispatcher, in management or executive management, etc. Okay, so it's very driver, very operations heavy. So I'll keep that in mind as we go through and talk. We'll hopefully touch on reasonable modification of policy. This is our newest regulation from 2015. It requires that we consider modifying our policies if it helps a person with a disability ride. Well, that's very difficult for us because those of us that have been in transit for a long time, we have always been told that policies are written in stone. Yet now we have a regulation that tells us that are our policies more like guidelines now? We follow them until we have some piece of information that tells us we're not supposed to. So it can be very confusing. Denial of service, of course, we struggle with that. How do we deny services to a person with a disability? Can we? Right? How do we do it properly so we don't get in trouble? I'll tell you right away, the truth is we can deny services to a rider. We can be in the right, and as I shared a few minutes ago, it doesn't mean they won't file a complaint against us or try to sue us, right? So what do? We follow our policies, we follow the regulations, we do everything correctly, we document it all, and that is our protection, right? Our documentation. We have audio and video on many of our vehicles. So I train staff to use hand gestures, right? Sometimes we don't have audio, we only have video. And someone complains that we did not secure their wheelchair or offer to secure their wheelchair, right? We use hand gestures. I'm going to secure your wheelchair, right? These are the little things that help. So we're documenting, right? We do that with lap and shoulder belt. That's a big one on fixed route. I'm also in many cases an expert witness in lawsuits. Sometimes I represent the transit agency. Sometimes I represent the rider, right? Depends on the situation. And one issue I keep coming up against is in fixed route bus service, drivers not every single time offering the lap and shoulder belt. Now the ADA does not require specifically that we offer the lap and shoulder belt every time for someone because it's optional, right? The regulations do tell us that if a rider, if every rider on a vehicle does not have a seatbelt and is not required to wear the seatbelt, we can't require the rider in the wheelchair to wear their seatbelt either. And so, our first question, wonderful. And so we have to make sure, though, that our riders do know that the lap and shoulder belt exists. And that's where the challenge starts to come in, right? Is it reasonable for us to assume that a person with a disability knows about and will remember that the bus has a lap and shoulder belt for them to use when they want to use it? Yes?
So ADA is, like the paratransit, is supposed to be parallel to the fixed route. So if you require a lap belt on your fixed route, you have to require a lap belt on your paratransit.
Thank you for the question. In my experience, yes, in general, we have equivalency requirements in paratransit and in fixed route, right? So service area. Our paratransit service area must be at a minimum the same as our fixed route service plus 3/4 of a mile, right? Our hours of operation, et cetera, et cetera. But it does not, in my experience, literally mean every single element that exists. The requirement for seat belts is vehicle specific, not service specific per se. And so if on our fixed route buses we don't have seat belts at any of our seats, right? That's why it would be for the person in the wheelchair, the lap and shoulder belt would be optional. And on our paratransit vehicles, cutaways, minivans, whatever, if every seat has a seat belt, then everyone is required to wear their seatbelt, including the rider in the wheelchair. So it is vehicle specific. I'm starting to come across very large cutaways now that are low floor, and the manufacturer's not putting seatbelts into those vehicles. And so the agency's like, well, now we can't require riders in wheelchairs to have them. We cannot make it mandatory. And I would say, yeah, I think that's consistent. I would look into the safety related issue. Should the vehicle have seatbelts? But the fact that it doesn't, we can't target a rider with a disability to do something that everyone else is not required to do, right? That doesn't include where they ride, because of course, people in wheelchairs, they only have wheelchair securement locations that they can be placed in. But short of that, riders have all the choices, the direction that they board their vehicle, right? Technically, the rider is supposed to choose that, whether they board forward-facing, rear-facing. I know in lift-equipped vehicles, we do prefer that they face outward, right? But the ADA does remind us that the rider should have the final choice as to the direction that they board, especially if they are placing themselves in the wheelchair securement area. They need to board in the direction that they are most comfortable with to maneuver themselves into the securement area. So that's a great question. You bring up some important issues with paratransit, right? Paratransit is a very, I would say, our most challenging, complicated form of transportation that we provide. We have on-time performance requirements. Every agency is supposed to have an on-time performance goal, right? This is the one way that we know whether we are providing a reasonable level of service or not, right? We have eligibility. The next session after this I'll be doing is ADA paratransit eligibility. We have a requirement in the regulations that we are to ensure that only those people that are unable to use fixed route services because of their disability qualifies for paratransit. So the language is actually something like we need to have a strict process of eligibility. right? So we'll talk about that next session, but what does that say to those agencies, many of you here, that might have a 0% denial in your ADA paratransit eligibility process, right? That doesn't sound strict, but we'll talk about that next session. So, yes?
So, since you brought up on-time performance,
Yes.
I work with our paratransit, and it's been really hard because of driver shortages. And so,
Yes, yes.
I guess my question is we have our on-time performance goals, but as we've been struggling, we work our targets there. Where do you see that going, right? We're going to get
Right.
a targeted review, we're going to be reviewed on that.
Yeah.
It's a little concerning for me because, we're seeing patterns where where we do have more consistent lates.
Mm-hmm.
And then as you're trying to juggle the work, it means that you have people on, right, it shifts, right? Because if you don't have enough drivers, then you have people on board longer.
Right.
Your trips are longer.
Yes.
And you're trying to accommodate every trip so you don't have any trip denials.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're doing so, it kind of pushes all the other pieces that we're responsible for.
Absolutely.
And it's hard because, we're hiring as fast as we can, but, some of our contractors have really struggled in getting that. And so, we're seeing consistent issues.
Right.
And do you have any suggestions,
Well,
we obviously want to be, providing the service that
Yes.
we need to. We want to be within the regulations.
right.
But
Yeah.
it's tough right now.
Yes. Well, first, we know that the ADA wants us to be 100% on time, right? In paratransit, we are told that we are not supposed to deny trips, right? Really, the language tells us that we cannot have a pattern or practice of denying trips. We cannot have a pattern or practice of late trips, et cetera, et cetera. Because we do set our on-time performance goal, my suggestion would be perhaps to readdress that goal. And is it realistic given our existing operating conditions? Right? Some agencies have 96% on time. What's your goal?
95.
95%. I'm thinking 92, 90% is sounding pretty good right now. Right? So that's an internal process that you'll go through. But number one, right, we need to be very clear and understanding of what we do have control over. We have control over that goal. So I know we want our contractors, especially in that environment, right, when it's agency contractor, we don't want the contractor to sort of underperform, right? We have these standards, but if it's just completely unattainable, then maybe that's probably one of the first things that I would look at is readdressing the on-time performance goal, right? Where are we? Where can we be? If you're at 92 and your goal is 95, I think even 92 is still pretty good right now, right? So in your triennial review, what will likely happen is that you're not achieving your goal, and they'll probably have a draft finding of that, and then they may ask for what is your plan to address that issue, right? And so I do think that needs to be a public process, right? You need to take it to the ridership and have some meetings and talk about the changing of this goal, and they may or not be supportive of that, but that's the process that we would follow. That's a really significant element in operating paratransit is that on-time performance goal. So, we cannot in paratransit limit the use of services. We cannot discourage people to use our services. So paratransit, again, so complicated. We have goals for hold times on the telephone, right? We have all these standards for late pickups and for, maybe on-time window. Here's some other things. We talk about paratransit operations, right? And this applies to any demand responsive. Demand responsive is dial-a-ride, human service transportation. Demand responsive is any type of service where a trip is initiated, right? So I have to call to make a trip reservation. That's demand responsive service. I don't do that in fixed route. I just stand here and I wait for the bus to come, right? That's really the biggest difference between those two types of services. I would start looking into my pickup window. What's your pickup window?
30 minutes.
30 minutes. So I would look at, we probably cannot expand our pickup window, is it 0 to 30?
10 to 20.
I would change it to 0 to 30, right? Because are we even right now going to be early? We're not going to be early.
Try not to be early.
Well, so you're saying even with the shortage of drivers, you are early more than,
I mean, just a real world thing is you've got drivers who look at their manifest and whether it's paper or whether it's on tablet, they're going, I'm gonna be behind.
yeah, they're already behind on the second trip of the day.
And so if they, in their mind, they're like, well, if I'm running a little early, and that's a training issue, right? It's a training
Right.
issue with our staff and the operators. But I
Right.
think it's also human nature for them to try and hedge that.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting to hear that they could be, I mean, occasionally early.
Usually it's when they start out, right?
It's in the beginning of the day, right?
Yeah.
Right. So,
I work with mine.
Mhm.
A lot of our operators, when they report to work, we get their 15-minute pre-check, check your bus,
Right.
make sure it's working. And their next pickup probably will be for the next 20, 30 minutes, possibly. So they'll go to that trip early, so the rest of their route is running
right.
close to on time, just
I
to
see.
fix that scheduling issue.
So then maybe we need to, because in paratransit, we can control the reservations, right? An hour before or an hour after the requested time. Maybe we need to schedule that first trip earlier if we are able to, so that there isn't so much time following pre-check to get them to that first pickup, right? And so in that case, I mean, if an agency is running early regularly, you don't want to move it to 0 to 30. But if that is only specific to the first trip of the day, and it's occasionally, and I'm 90% of the time when something goes wrong, it's because I'm late, I would consider moving to a 0 to 30. Yeah, question?
A comment. Where our office is a place that you guys would come to. If they go to an hour early, our classes that they're taking doesn't start until 10:30.
Sure.
And so if they're coming at 9:30, that takes the staff from working in their office trying to get stuff ready
Right.
for that class. Because we have to, once one of our consumers comes, we have to go and babysit her.
Right,
whatever you
right.
wanna call it.
No, I understand. If trips to a day, adult daycare center, for example, are those the first trips of the day? May or may not be
In the afternoon, it would be.
in the afternoon.
And it would be more
Okay.
pickup from the big programs.
Right. Right, yeah.
There is that pressure.
But there's always the pressure of the
In all of our
timing.
Passengers, especially day programs, there's that appointment time.
Right.
Where we can't arrive earlier than that time that their staff is ready for,
Right.
so there's that as well.
Yeah. So this is where the ADA requirements and the realities of the needs of riders and the agencies that the riders frequent are starting to conflict. Because the ADA tells us that we are just origin to destination providers in paratransit, right? You give us an address, you give us a pickup time, we can negotiate that pickup time, we'll pick you up, we'll take you there, we're moving on, right? But what it's sounding like is that there's a relationship, and I understand and that these exist, and I've dealt with these relationships with agencies all my career, but there's a relationship with an agency that is now, their program hours are dictating how you operate. And the ADA does not require that kind of accommodation. It can be provided. I know why we do provide it, because we want to meet the needs of our riders. But every agency, when we start feeling the pain of certain things, like you are starting to feel, we have to start asking ourselves, can we continue to provide the accommodations that we've been providing, right? And so if there are no trips in the middle of the day, right, and the first pickup is at the adult day center in the afternoon to pick up at 1 o'clock, and your driver's free after noon and wants to get there early but can't pick up too early, right? This is where some choices need to be made. And the choices might make it easier on your operation and might make it very difficult for your rider to actually participate in your program. Or might make it more difficult on your staff, who now have to become more available with their time or have to be more responsible for the rider. And so this is actually fascinating to me because this is how ADA paratransit has evolved. It's evolved away from being public transit, right, to being now morphing into sort of a human service transportation provider. And when we do that, I'm not saying you shouldn't, but when we do this, we start making accommodations for agencies, and we lose control, and we lose sometimes our operational efficiency, because the rider's saying, I have to do this, and it has to be this, and it has to be this. But the ADA in paratransit gives us a 2-hour window to negotiate, right? Now, if an agency chooses not to use that 2-hour window to its benefit and instead picks a time that meets the needs of the rider but makes your operation more difficult, that's a choice you've made, and you have to live with that choice, right? So I don't want to, again, tell you that you should not be doing what you're doing, but I do want to bring to light the fact that all of these things are choices, right? We started off this session, choices. And forever, especially in paratransit, we are going to have choices that agencies make. So when we talk about accommodations in paratransit, for example, there are things that agencies are doing constantly that are not required, but we do them because we're trying to meet the needs of our riders. We might send a particular vehicle, right? We have 2 types of vehicles in our fleet, and the small one's really bumpy, and a rider wants the large one because it's a softer ride. That's an accommodation. That's considered an administrative burden, technically. We don't need to provide that if we don't want to, if we can't, right? What are some others in paratransit? A particular driver. Do not send this particular driver. Do not share ride me with anyone. Do not share ride me with someone with the service animal. The list goes on and on and on. All of these things in paratransit are considered administrative burdens. They put extra pressure on your system. So if you have already driver shortage, and you have pressures, if you will, from the agencies that you serve, and on top of it, you're providing all of these other extra accommodations, some of my clients are in this situation and they bury themselves underneath it all. And they're my client because we're trying to figure out how we can redefine the services that they provide so that we can still meet the rider's needs, but take some of that pressure off that they admit that is self-inflicting, right? All the things that I've described, these are choices that an agency makes. It's self-inflicted. And so sometimes we deal with it and we push through, and this is the way it is. And sometimes agencies just, especially if they're at capacity, and they have to start figuring out a way to provide more trips with the same amount of drivers and vehicles, etc. These agencies all of a sudden are looking for ways that they can recreate themselves. And sometimes that is now going back to the ridership and telling the ridership, we can no longer do that. I worked for, my first job in transit was with a ADA paratransit agency. And ADA paratransit in Southern California, Access Services, it's like the 2nd largest paratransit agency in the country. They're doing something like 15,000 trips a day in LA County. Can you imagine? When I was there, we were doing like 6 or 7. We thought we were going nuts. So we can define these services a little better. When we started Access Services, we were really just kind of providing service, trying to prove the concept. We didn't have a whole lot of control. We let riders just do whatever they wanted to do. We did group certifications. I would go out to facilities and I'd leave that day and we just certified 75 people. It didn't take long. After a couple years, we were at capacity, over budget. We realized all the things we were doing to build the agency was destroying it. So we had to kind of right-size things once again. One of the things we did was over our service area. We were providing service. Our standard definition of our paratransit service area was like 3 miles. Well, the ADA says that your service area is, 3/4 of a mile, right? So that was self-inflicted. So we had to go back through the process and we went to the public and ridership and we redefined our service area as 3/4 of a mile. And then we added zones. Why is that helpful and important? Because Those zones can be, if you do it properly, can be identified as premium service, right? We are only required to provide premium service when we have and are fully delivering the demand for our standard ADA required service, which is 3/4 of a mile. So you can see the problem there. If an agency has a service area defined as 3 miles, that is our ADA paratransit service area, another self-inflicted choice. When the ADA says our service area only needs to be 3/4 of a mile. Now I know we do that because we're trying to meet the needs of our riders. Once again, we're going to continue. I could go example after example of where agencies make choices that might help one group and that might be actually undermining their ability to effectively provide on-time operation of service. So I've always been a fan of starting with ADA minimum requirements. Let's do that, great. And then let's see what we can add, right? Maybe we add a zone, now up to 1.5 miles. That's premium service. We charge an extra $1 for that, right? We start doing these things because it costs. It costs to add an extra 3/4 of a mile onto our service area. Everything we do extra has a cost. Manpower, people power, excuse me, dollars, time. Everything has a cost. So sorry I went off on that paratransit tangent, but yeah.
I have a question with that. Actually, right before I came to the convention here, I had an issue with a passenger that was in the 3/4 mile on the parking lot of the business, but the business itself was outside the 3/4 mile. We follow the parking lot as a business. It's running our and it's our F routes. It's running our service late, so our operators get about 20-25 minutes late
Yeah.
to their EOL, their
Right.
line. So where's the line in the sand on the 3/4 mile?
Sure. So we need to be reasonable about it, right? We do measure our 3/4 of a mile as the crow flies, so in a straight line, right? Not based on the streets and turns. I would say, if I'm trying to be reasonable, I would create a definition that says if my line touches a property, that property is in my 3/4 of a mile. So if the line touches the parking lot, that building, another 30 feet, whatever, that building is in my service area. I think that's reasonable because often we're estimating. We could be off by 10, 20, 30 feet in our line. And so let's be reasonable about it, you know? That would be my guidance on that. I feel like it would be really difficult for us to argue that that facility is not in our service area when our line is
Yeah, and the difficult part of this one is
touching
we
it.
have one route that is way within her 3/4 mile to her home, and then we have another route that is completely through on her drop off basically, and it's more than 3/4 of a mile. So it's two different routes,
Bus routes?
bus routes, yeah. So
But one of the bus routes, 3/4 of a mile from one of those routes is in her home?
in her home. So the one that we're picking her up from her home is way beyond 3/4 of a mile. So
It doesn't
within,
go off of the bus route, it goes off of your entire service area.
right,
So
so
this is her route deviation.
route deviation. So we
Ah.
have two route deviation buses, and
How far are you deviating?
on the other one is past. Well, the one is in 3/4 of a mile. This is our F70.
Right.
And then we have an F78 that is. They're both, and this is where I say that the parking lot's outside, because that one is outside, where we can, if we really wanted to, we can have her transferred to the 78, and it'll be easier on the drivers part of it. But I don't know how to solve this. It's a topic right now. That I'm
Yeah.
concerned.
I mean, you know, when you get to choose how you deviate.
Right.
The requirement at a minimum is you deviate 3/4 of a mile because that's the ADA paratransit standard requirement, right? So any deviation beyond 3/4 of a mile is a choice, and it's going to have operational impacts, right? Again, I know we do it to help people because they need trips, and you know we are defining our service area, but You know, it's also very difficult. I want you to think about these accommodations, these extra things that we do for riders. I want you to think about how difficult it's going to be for you once you can no longer provide them, and how you're going to communicate that to them, right? And so my warning to agencies is always, sometimes we shouldn't be providing certain accommodations because we can't always guarantee that we're going to provide them. But the expectation on the rider's side is that as soon as you do it for them, that they will receive this accommodation. And in their mind, they're just getting service. In their mind, this is what you do. In your mind, you know you're doing something extra. They have an expectation that it will always be this way. And so the other way that I help my clients that are in these types of troubles is that I help them clearly define what all of these types of services are, right? So even if we don't stop going outside of our service area, our 3/4 of a mile, even if that doesn't change, how we refer to it, what we call it, is very important, right? We can put in our material that our standard service area is 3/4 of a mile. However, we do provide as an accommodation service up to 3 miles. And then we should add in there always something like, however, you know, this level of service will only be provided something like if the agency is able to, right? So it gives us, hopefully we can educate and communicate with our ridership that this is something extra they're getting. And hopefully they appreciate it. And hopefully they also know that we might take it away if we can no longer do this anymore, right? So that's why I like to have my services defined as my ADA minimum requirements. And then everything I do above that, like literally everything, I am defining it as premium, as exceeding the minimum requirements. And I'm constantly communicating that with ridership so that they know that this is extra and that we can use that as a tool in case, you know what, we just don't have the budget anymore. You know what, ridership down. We need to change our service area. It's going to be easier to do that under this type of approach that I've described. Yeah, my last work with Los Angeles Metro was to train 6,000 bus drivers. I developed a 9-hour ADA compliance training, which included something like 4 hours of wheelchair procurement and other assistance practice on a vehicle. So 5 hours classroom, 4 hours on a vehicle. And I had to train the trainers, and then I had to provide oversight to make sure that that training was delivered properly and effectively system-wide. And it took 5 years for those 6,000 drivers to be trained. Every morning, Metro puts out 2,200 buses. So sometimes agencies will say to me, or individuals, like, you're used to these big systems, you know, you can't help my agency. You know, we only have 10 vehicles, 15 vehicles. You can't relate. The only way to help a large agency is to chop it up into small pieces. I can't change 6,000 drivers, but I can change 100 drivers there and maybe 250 over there. And so the agency got chopped up into small pieces, right? And if we're talking about making improvements in service, right, I believe very strongly in transit, this old adage of 20% of people cause 80% of the problems. And so what I did was I identified the 20% of our lowest performing drivers, ADA complaints, right, write-ups, various other issues. We identified those 20% and we went at those 20% first. And so if we raise the floor of performance, we have actually improved system-wide performance. We've made the whole system better because our worst service has now become better. So I think no matter what size your agency, some of you know, especially in management, you know which of your drivers sort of give you the biggest trouble. You know which of your drivers are the least sensitive to the needs of people with disabilities. You know which ones they are, right? The ones getting the complaints all the time, right? You can target them. Target in meaning retraining. Train them until they're doing it the way we need them to do it. Maybe it's a little more difficult now because we can't even afford to lose a bad driver anymore. So I know it's difficult now, but these are the ways that we go about making improvements to our system, right? Helping people with disabilities and using our services. And so, any other questions? Incidents you've had recently? Right? We talk about discrimination, right? We are not supposed to discriminate against people with disabilities. What does discrimination look like in public transit? Denying them service, discouraging them from using our service, making our services too difficult to use, right? There are lots of examples of the ways. It doesn't even have to be on purpose, right? Overt, which is like straightforward discrimination, that's easy, right? We know that exists. We know how to deal with that. But the discrimination that happens accidentally because maybe we've implemented a new policy and all of a sudden it's having negative impacts on riders, right? So it doesn't matter whether it's planned or on purpose or it's by accident. When we know, when we identify that we have issues with riders, right? We have responsibility to address those things and to eliminate them, right? We are supposed to remove barriers to the use of our services. Yes?
What if you come across a rider who has Alzheimer's in their family?
Yes.
And is starting to forget stuff?
Yeah. Yeah. What kind of service does your agency operate?
Picking them up and taking them to town and.
But are you a paratransit operator? Are you human service agency?
We're both, we got our fixed route in the morning, and then during the time that we still have 4 hours in the afternoon, then we help,
I see.
help
Okay.
take them to town and stuff.
Sure. So riders do have responsibilities. Okay, it's not all the burden of transit operators or transportation providers, right? That's why we have a code of conduct in our policies, and I hope you have policies. Here's the last policy manual that I did for my transit agency. Hundreds of pages, very detailed. They don't all need to be like this, but what they do need to have in there is what, number one, we expect of our drivers, operators, right? What they are supposed to do, what they should not be doing, etc. And we should also have in there some type of code of conduct that explains very clearly what we expect of our riders, right? Safety, not to do anything violent. We talk about how we will address people with odors, right, etc. And so riders have a responsibility to meet our standards as well. So I can remember many examples when I worked for a paratransit agency where we would drop someone off and they would just start walking down the street like they knew where they were going, and then later that night we'd get a call, can't find my loved one, where are they? And they just disappeared in the neighborhood. So I think in every instance they were found, but that's when we start to learn, oh, this person cannot be left unattended, right? Well, now are we going to have drivers wait with someone until the attendant comes? Does that mean we're going to be parking a vehicle for 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes until someone comes? That destroys our operational efficiency. So that would be considered an accommodation, right? And there have been times in my career where I have had to tell a rider and their family, I'm sorry, our paratransit service does not meet your needs, right? You can have, as an operational choice, you don't have to provide attendant services, right? We talk about in ADA paratransit, here we go, what is providing a reasonable level of assistance? Well, the ADA tells us that it is not reasonable for us to act as a personal care attendant. Our drivers are not trained to provide medical assistance, right? Waiting 20, 30 minutes with a rider while an attendant or someone else comes, a family member comes, that is considered to be the role of a personal care attendant, which is why in paratransit we have to allow PCAs, personal care attendants, to ride for free, right? It's all been designed into the system. And so if we follow the ADA minimum requirements and this particular rider requires the driver to be waiting and waiting or handing them off, right? Because they have Alzheimer's, and this person will just start walking down the street and get lost if we don't hand them off to someone. Well, now we're moving into requesting an accommodation, and do we think that that's reasonable or not? And I have had to, as I shared, tell families that I'm sorry, what you're asking us to do exceeds the minimum requirements of the ADA, and we are not capable of doing that. That's a hard conversation to have, and we don't want, because we're trying to help people, especially in paratransit, human service. Like, we are here to help people, but in paratransit, and even in human service agency, if you wanted to, paratransit gives us the guidelines to say no. Actually, the ADA gives us a lot of opportunity to say no, but I find that agencies say yes all the time because they want to help, right? And they're thinking about helping this rider now. You're not thinking about the headache it's going to be to do all of these extra accommodations in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, even next month. We never know. We never know, right? So it is not considered to be a reasonable level of assistance for us to act as a personal care attendant, right? We don't mess with people's oxygen tanks, right? We don't carry their medical devices. We don't hand them their medication. We don't do those things. We're not trained to provide them. Now, can your drivers do these things? If you want them to, yes. But as soon as we start providing some medical assistance, aren't we accepting responsibility for them? And it's not for me to tell you that you should or should not accept responsibility for them, but you should know that by doing some of these things, you are. So if you're worried about lawsuits, etc., these are some primary possibilities, sources of challenges, of issues. Right now, I'm working as an expert witness on a case where a vehicle came to pick up a rider at a where do they get their blood dialysis treatment center. Vehicle pulls up, right? Driver goes inside to get the rider. The two of them come out, and the driver sees that someone parked next to the van could not deploy the ramp anymore. So the driver said, "Please wait here, I'm going to move the van." Driver moves the van and backs into a space. The rider starts to walk towards the vehicle before the driver could come out and assist, because the driver had to open the door, deploy the ramp. Driver falls. The rider falls, hits their head. Badly injured. Who's responsible? Right? This is what can happen in many lawsuits. The driver's like, I asked her to wait. I told her I had to reposition the vehicle. The driver didn't call for her and say, okay, come on out. Even though there was a curb cut, the sidewalk, the driver parked in the disabled parking area. So we don't have video of how or why the person fell, but blink of an eye, boom, she was down, hit her head on the concrete. So how we provide services, we do the best we can. Sometimes riders, they just kind of do their own thing. So maybe if this rider, that's why paratransit, we have so much more information than in sometimes other forms of service, right? They went through eligibility, they qualified, we have their information. Hopefully we know all of their medical challenges and issues. So then we know how to provide service to them. It's more difficult, like for a taxi cab company that's just got a call, right? They just pick up, drop off, move on. I don't think the driver did anything wrong in this case, but they're always trying to hold someone accountable because someone got hurt, especially, right? Yeah. Of course, we do assist people using wheelchairs, right? Securement can be difficult. I have a webinar, Advanced Wheelchair Securement Strategies, where it's very technical. I go through how wheelchairs are designed and how scooters are designed. And once we understand their design elements, it makes securing any device a lot easier, right? So I would recommend that, definitely. We still need to provide assistance to people using wheelchairs if they are very heavy or are very wide. Did you have a question, sir?
Yeah, so your webinars are available for anyone?
Yeah, you can go on my website, guru.co, and go to workshops, and that's there. I often have groups of drivers that will log in, and or multiple drivers from agencies.
So
And
is it recorded
It's on Zoom, but it's not recorded. It's me, like this, but on the TV screen. Yeah, we walk through all of that, and I go through all of the different types of devices and share where we look for. You know, wheelchair securement is very interesting because we have ideal locations that we try to secure to, but sometimes we can't get to them. People have bags, the wheelchair's broken, the list goes on and on. Our wheelchair securement area is really small, right? Sometimes all of these things are going on at once, yet we still need to secure the wheelchair. So it's not acceptable for us to say, I couldn't do it, I'm sorry, and then they ride unsecured. That's just not reasonable. So we do have to figure it out. So I teach that there are ideal locations, and then there are locations that normally we would want to avoid. But if that's the best we can do, if that's all we can reach, then maybe that's what we do. I also train to do securement in particular order every time so that we have consistency, because when we are consistent, we have a much better chance of also being safe and being thorough, right? I've worked with so many agencies that actually don't have a wheelchair securement policy at all. Like, they don't tell their drivers exactly how it's supposed to be done, step by step, every single time. And maybe there's never been a problem with that, but when there is a problem, it's usually because one driver decides to do something that they thought made sense, and all of a sudden, here we are in trouble, right? So then,
Do you have that printed off, the order of securement for us to have, or is that on your website also? Or?
I do provide that information, yeah. I mean, I'll share it with you. So when we secure, we always want to start in the rear, right? We start in the rear because, let's just say it's a power wheelchair. Well, people accidentally hit the joystick, or they hit the knobs all the time, and then they start moving forward. The ADA suggests to us that we can ask that a person power their wheelchair off, but technically we cannot demand that they power their wheelchair off. So we want to secure the rear first, so that that's the safest for the driver. And then we secure the front, and then we move to the lap and the shoulder belts. And so we follow that policy, that process every time. I've been coming across agencies, you know, I work with agencies on their property and work with the drivers, and we do wheelchair securement. And these wheelchair securement spaces are so tight, especially in the rear. So when we talk about securement, we have to consider vehicle configuration, right? So for those of you that are involved in purchasing of your vehicles, please purchase vehicles that have wheelchair securement areas that are oversized, because we often have wheelchairs that are oversized, right? Even if a wheelchair is large or heavy, etc., we still have to secure it, right? If it boards, if it fits on our vehicle, we have to transport. So we need to figure that out and give our drivers, our staff, the best chance of doing their job and doing it easily, right? Train them well to become experts, and then give them equipment that actually supports when there is a challenging rider. I was working, so there's a manufacturer of wheelchair securement equipment. I'm not going to say their name, but they had a new product that they were showing me. And you know how we have like the floor brackets, and we can adjust where the mechanisms go, right? Well, this was a fixed system. You could not adjust or widen the straps, the mechanisms at all. And it was very, very narrow. And I said, this looks great for 80% of the wheelchairs out there. And we need securement systems and securement locations that are designed to help accommodate the 20% of the difficult wheelchairs that we have to secure. See, that's the mistake a lot of agencies make. They buy equipment for the standard wheelchair. No, we should be buying, my guidance to you would be to buy equipment for the most difficult wheelchairs to secure, which are long and wide. And if we have equipment that accommodates long and wide wheelchairs, then we'll be able to serve everyone. But if you buy equipment that's really designed for the average wheelchair, your drivers are constantly going to be struggling to fit, to secure. We talk about COVID, you know, and getting close to riders. you're always going to have your drivers pushing up against the riders because of an undersized securement area. Yes.
So, speaking of size and weight, we have a difficult situation. This is on a route deviation route. Some of our equipment has 800-pound lifts. Newer equipment has 1,000-pound lifts.
Yeah.
So our operator comes across this gentleman who's, the size of the chair and the size of the person with our 800-pound lift couldn't handle that.
Right.
And so,
And we know it couldn't handle because they tried to board and couldn't.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and so, when you're in that situation, right, on the street, trying to accommodate that, so our temporary solution is that we're trying to only put the newer buses on that route, right, but that means that we're adjusting our operation to accommodate basically one individual.
That's a choice. You can tell them.
So from an operator perspective, what options would you have? I mean,
If we've attempted to board a rider and our equipment could not accommodate them, we document the you-know-what out of it. We inform the rider that we were incapable of boarding you with this particular equipment, and until this issue is remedied, we are unable to pick you up. Now, they might make a request for a reasonable accommodation for you to dispatch the vehicle that does work for them. And then you have to decide whether you want to provide that accommodation or not. That would be considered an administrative burden. We can deny that request if it puts too much, if it's too difficult on our system. So, but we have to go through that process of communicate, of denying them service, putting it in writing, informing them why, right? Hopefully you have video or something of the instance where the person was unable to board. And see, we have to be comfortable doing all of those things as well.
I've had a similar situation with Rotary, 3 of our grants.
Yeah.
Documenting everything, and then, just what we did with him is he's still eligible, but we cannot provide him the ride.
Yes. Yes. Maybe part of the problem is the wheelchair weighs 600 pounds. And if they got a lighter wheelchair, maybe that would fix it. So we just let them know, and we document and communicate with them that when they believe they have a solution, that we're more than happy to send a vehicle back out to reevaluate the issue. Right? There's lots of different solutions. But
on that one, it's more of a fixed route, right? It's route deviation. On our paratransit, we manage our own chairs, so that, we have a heads up, but when it's
Right.
someone that's unexpected in
Right.
that situation, in that one moment,
right.
it's tough.
It is. And so that's where our road supervisor might come in. If it's much more difficult than fixed route to deal with. Yes.
On that situation, does the driver ride the lift with the, he's standing?
No. Well, hopefully, this is my opinion. I hope no one has policies that require drivers to ride on the lift with the riders. That's very, very unsafe. And so when we talk about choices, so why don't I like that practice? We are requiring the driver to ride on the lift, I think, to make the rider safe. There's some issue of stability, they can't keep their balance, whatever that might be. I'm not a fan of a policy that puts the driver in jeopardy in order to keep the rider safe, right? So when we talk about expectations of the rider, if they need the lift to board, should be able to sit or stand on the lift safely on their own. I had an agency that created a policy recently. Well, at the time, it was a brand new policy where the day before, something like that, the week before, they had someone in a wheelchair on a lift leave their wheelchair on, because they can if they want to, and accidentally flew right off the lift. So the next day, the manager, we can fix this. Changed the policy to require the driver to stand on the lift. And I said, what do you think would have happened to the driver? I mean, it was like a 600-pound wheelchair, with the rider. What do you think would have happened to the driver? You would have 2 people on the concrete. And so they realized yeah, that probably wasn't a great policy. So choices, we all have choices, right? But I would just hate for the driver to get injured, right? Just by losing their balance, not even because of what the rider does. So if a rider, I would also come to the conclusion that if a rider is incapable of riding on the lift, then they cannot use my service. And then maybe they need a PCA, right? Maybe they need a PCA to take the risk and to provide the attendant services to ride on the lift to keep the rider safe. That would be my preference. Yeah, thank you.
What if you offer a door-to-door service and you have a client that lives in a residential property that's not ADA compliant?
Okay, so in paratransit, you offer door-to-door service, and the facility is not ADA compliant. In what way is it not ADA? In what way does it threaten the safety of the driver? How about that?
You have a client that you're picking up that can't get to a main surface. So in this situation, this client lives on main level, but he doesn't have a way to get his wheelchair out to the sidewalk without going off the sidewalk over the grass into the parking lot.
Okay,
So the driver is required
so,
to pick him up over a curb, bring him through the grass or snow onto a flat level to get into the van.
right. So this is where our policy starts to come in, right? Among other things, I would draft a policy, and I have for many agencies, that very clearly defines what the driver will and won't do when providing door-to-door service. I like the term beyond the curb, because we're not always going to the door, but we are often going beyond the curb, you know what I mean? So splitting hairs a little bit, but so that would include, driver will only provide door-to-door assistance when it is safe for them to do so. Situations that are defined as unsafe include an unsafe path of travel to the door, going upstairs, losing effective continuing control of the vehicle, meaning we do not have sight of the vehicle anymore. So we can define all of these things that we are saying it is unsafe for our driver to do that. I would include, just in general, that drivers do not drag wheelchairs. Drivers do not push wheelchairs through grass. Drivers do not push wheelchairs up and down curbs. So if we wanted to, we could create an expectation, a requirement that the rider needs to get to a safe and accessible location. That would be considered the door. Does that make sense? Yeah. So if it's unsafe and inaccessible from their door to right here, and the van's there, from a safety perspective, as we've defined in our policy, the driver can only go to here. And it is the rider's responsibility to get there to here. Now, does that mean now this rider isn't going to get to use your service and cannot live independently? That's possible, right? But I'm not a fan, and I discourage agencies from making policy decisions that require their driver to do unsafe things. Because if your driver gets injured dragging this guy's wheelchair over the snow, that lawsuit, right? That's going to be huge against your agency. And they're just going to have to open your policy manual or whatever, the training, or the driver's just going to say, I've done this hundreds of times, and your agency is going to have no defense. And that's I don't ever like to tell an agency you're out of compliance or that's a bad idea. I just like to say this is a vulnerability in your program, right? We had a question here first.
Wouldn't that be the homeowner's responsibility then?
The property owners to make it ADA accessible, but some facilities are old and are grandfathered in, and so you don't have to make them accessible, but that has no impact on us, right? My guidance to you is to have policies that only allow your driver to go as far as it is safe. And I know it's going to have negative impacts on riders, but But this is where the choices come in, and I don't want you to be in a position, again, of your driver getting injured because you're asking them to do things that were just not reasonable, that we cannot defend, right? That could easily, the fact that we're asking this question, we know this is not safe. I'd be rewriting that policy. Sir? Easier said than done, I know, but
You know, in that same situation, why don't you buy a ramp to have the driver have on his vehicle put on that grass area?
that,
Do you do that, or is that a?
no, I wouldn't do that because the driver could drop that ramp on their foot. Like, we're just adding, we just continue to add responsibility to the agency that's not our responsibility. The accessibility of a facility, of their home, is not our responsibility. We can't save everyone, right? And so that's what often gets agencies in trouble. We don't want to say no. We can't say no. And then we find ourselves in trouble, and then we're like, oh, wow. Yeah.
Another one, so we used to have I don't know if it was a policy or not, but, manual wheelchairs where the brakes don't work when we're going up the ramp. At first we were told that we couldn't enforce it. So now, even though their brake's not working, to me it's a safety concern. Can we enforce, if we did write a policy, could we enforce it?
Say that one more time.
So like a manual wheelchair,
Okay.
their brakes are not, their brake system is not working.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So before, we used to have policies saying that we would contact, well, I don't even know if it was a policy, but we would contact the caregivers or whoever
Right.
to get that fixed. Now, we've been told that we can't enforce it, that if
Yeah.
their brake's not working, we have to still transport it.
Okay, so if we talk about denial of service, the regulations call it direct threat, right? We can deny service if there is a risk to the health and safety of others, okay? So we would need to ask ourselves in this situation, is there a safety concern? Is it real, which would be objective, or is it anticipated, or is it possible? That would be subjective. Maybe something's going to go wrong. That's not the same as something's going wrong, right? So we have to be really careful here. We can't, so a similar issue I hear a lot about are agencies that have policies that require a person's wheelchair to have footrests. And if they don't have footrests, we will not transport them. That's not compliant. That's not compliant because, yes, it's possible that there are some riders without footrests and their legs are dragging and they're causing issues, but then there are a lot of them that it's really not a safety issue. And so I think that falls into the same category. Would we like a wheelchair to have brakes? Yes. The fact that the rider gets to decide whether they set those brakes or not on our vehicle tells me we really can't require that they have them at all. If we can't require that they use them, I don't even see how we can require that they have them at all, right? So does that mean someone's trying to roll themselves? You know, I hope in a situation like this, the driver would offer, can I assist you exiting the bus, exiting the vehicle, right? Say this is a ramp-equipped bus, and they say, no, I'm fine. And then they go to roll themselves down, and then they lose control, and they roll out, and they crash, and they fall. That could happen. That was their choice, right? I hope we documented that we offered it. I hope there's audio and video, right? The hand gesture thing, I could save a lot of you in a lot of different ways. So I really recommend you use that and train your drivers to do that.
A lot
But
of the concerns are when the operator's lifting the passenger and they're walking into the bus.
Yeah.
There's that safety belt.
Yeah.
But sometimes with the weight and stuff, that's not enough.
yeah, I understand. You know, some agencies buy wheel chocks, little mini ones, and when the lift is up, or even before they put the lift up, they put the wheel chocks underneath so they cannot roll back. And then they lift it, and then they go in, and then they pull them in, and so there's nothing preventing the use of those. So we have some tools. You know, we talk about tools for wheelchair securement. You know, the use of straps can be very, very helpful, right? We train our drivers to use these. We give them, the blue ones are the ones we give the drivers. They're usually, you know, wide open, and they keep these. I've helped agencies create wheelchair securement or wheelchair strapping and marking programs where we put the yellow ones on and they stay on there permanently so that when the driver sees them, they know exactly where to secure to. We can do that, especially if you have in-person eligibility. I know a lot of agencies don't, but if you do, we can evaluate and attach these very easily. So we want to be, I mean, I think you've heard many examples of things that we can do and we do have control of, and many examples of things where the rider gets to choose, right? And they're not always choosing. I mean, look at scooters, especially three-wheel scooters. Very high center of gravity, prone to tipping like crazy. We can have a policy that suggests, would you consider transferring to a seat? It's a safer ride for you. And they can say no. I would then document it in the system that I offered. And then when they fall over on the easiest of turns, at least we're protected. The person might be injured and we don't want to deal with that. But a lot of this is about protecting our agency, right? Some of the best ways we can protect our agency is to not implement maybe questionable policies to begin with, right? And then informing our ridership of what their choices are so that they know. And then documenting when they do make some of these choices. Like in fixed route bus, if we secure their wheelchair, and then I hope you will now, if you don't already, every single time offer lap and shoulder belt to the rider using hand gestures, right? And they say no, and you say no, okay. And then you go back and you somehow note it in the system. Because when there's an accident, I promise you, and they get injured, they're going to state something regarding that you did not attach the lap and shoulder belt, or that they didn't know that it existed. That's how we protect ourselves. I've had many lawsuits as an expert witness on that issue, as I shared. So we want to make decisions about denying service from the objective. We need information. That's why I don't look at a wheelchair and say, oh, it's too wide, I cannot board it. I have to board it. And if I'm able to successfully board the wheelchair and they're able to get, and I can secure them, then they ride, right? So even if they weigh 1,000 pounds and our equipment is rated for 800, it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that the equipment can't handle it. We only know objectively whether equipment can handle a certain weight or not, or a certain rider or not, and their wheelchair by giving them the opportunity to board. I can't eye it. That's just not acceptable, right? So we need to be very careful. Let's talk about, what time are we supposed to finish? Are we supposed to be done now?
11.
We finish at 11. Okay. Body odors. This is a big one, right? People smell bad. Drivers, I've worked with thousands of them, and if someone smells a little bit bad, or even the perfume is too strong, right, they want to deny service. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I've come across many that do. And so the same standard applies, right? We need objective information in order to make a decision as to whether we are going to board this person or not. There is a difference between someone who smells like urine, that they smell like urine, versus they're standing in a puddle of it, okay? They could be wearing like a Depends or something. It's not unusual for someone in a wheelchair to have soiled themselves in the wheelchair. It's not dripping, we don't see it, but they smell like it, right? So we just need to make sure. So let me look at the standard here. We can deny services if someone is seriously disruptive. Well, in order for us to define seriously disruptive, we need to define disruptive. So what do you think disruptive? How would you define a disruptive action? Maybe annoying. Maybe you don't like it, but it's not unsafe, right? Someone smells like urine. That's annoying. You know, we have people, the term we use now in California is unhoused. We don't use the term homeless anymore. Don't ask why. That's a whole nother session. But so we have someone who's unhoused and they board our vehicle and they have body odors and we want to deny them service. Well, we can't do that, right? We can't do that because their odor is disruptive, is annoying. Well, now we can define seriously disruptive, which is, right, creating a safety or health hazard, is potentially preventing the driver, the operator, from safely operating the vehicle, right? That's a very high standard. So when I first joined Metro, I saw that we had a lot of incidences of buses being shut down and riders being denied service because of their odor or whatever it was. And so I told the operations center, anytime you get a call like this, call me. And I'd rush down there. And for a long time I was thinking, like, how am I going to make an objective observation? What is going to be objective in this situation? Because even if I smell it, that's still my opinion, right? The driver has an opinion. And then I started thinking, well, what about the opinion of the other riders on board? So I rushed down there. I see the driver standing over there. Don't go in there. I board the bus through the back and I look. Actually, I boarded through the front and I looked. And I see the person who, appeared to be homeless. And I could smell something. And there were still like 6 or 7 other riders on board. And I thought to myself, that is the objective evidence that I need. Yes, it's annoying. Yes, it was disruptive, the odor, but it wasn't so disruptive that these riders did not stay on board. So maybe 1 or 2 out of 10 times where I would rush down there to look, the vehicle was actually cleared out. All the other times, the riders were still on board, sitting closer to that person than the driver was. And I would tell the driver, I don't have objective evidence here. You might not like it. We consider this to be disruptive. This is annoying. It does not meet the standard of seriously disruptive. I need you to move on into service and not do this again. And we stopped seeing so many incidences of this. Drivers knew they couldn't get away with it anymore. So we always need objective evidence, right? We always need information to make a decision, right? It's the information making the decision, not my opinion. So I see a wheelchair. It's too wide. Oh, it's too wide to board. I'm sorry. I have to deny you services. Opinion. I let them board. The lift starts to struggle. The vehicle starts to lean. I shut it down. Objective. I now have objective evidence. I'm sorry. I cannot safely board you. I have to deny you service. Right? This is the standard. And that's why, yes, we can deny services to people with disabilities, but we really need to make sure we're on solid footing to do that, right? Very important. And we need to document it. Document. Yes?
We have a rider that's very large. To get in past the arms of the lift, you have to ask him to bring his elbows in.
Okay.
You get him in there, and to tie him down, he doesn't have a chair that has just your normal tie down. So you gotta figure out a safe way to tie him down.
Yes.
His body flakes.
Ah.
His smell is very offensive to everybody that's drove him.
Yes.
We typically have just him in the van.
On
With
purpose?
that-
On purpose or?
No,
Okay.
just because of how it ends up.
Okay.
Because he's so far on the other side of town.
Got it.
So with his body flaking and it gets on you and you have to get down there, way down underneath his chair to find anywhere.
Right.
He's just massive. Would that fall under objective or disruptive?
Well, I think anytime something is being transferred from one person to another, and it's something bodily fluid or bodily, I don't even know how we would define these flakes, right? If that can be documented, and pictures and proven, and we have other people that, I think we can, if we wanted to, start building a case to deny services to this person until this issue is fixed. So I don't know if that's going to mean they're just going to have to rub lotion on him before he gets picked up, right? And the other thing you want to remember is we can make recommendations for solutions when we deny service, but we should not make the choice as to what they ultimately do. Because if we make the choice and it doesn't work out, we are responsible. I had an agency tell me a story that they had a rider in paratransit. First time she had ever ridden. She was quadriplegic, and they get her on the vehicle, they secure her wheelchair, and driver takes the first turn, nice and easy. Her head falls over. She starts to suffocate. She has no control of the muscles in her neck. This happened 3 or 4 times on that trip. Driver informs management, of course, and dispatch, and they contact the family, and they let the family know, like, this is an unsafe situation. We are going to have to deny services until this issue is resolved. And so, what are some possible solutions to this? Her head was falling over. Yeah, a little neck brace, something like that. Cervical collar, yes. The presence of a personal care attendant to be there to, right? That was the other problem, right? The driver had to pull over and straighten her head every time. We were touching her face, like that's personal care attendant type stuff. We don't do that. So overstep the bounds. Ultimately what they decided, anyone else have another solution? There was a third one that they actually went with. They put a strap around her forehead. They put a headrest on and then they strapped her head to it. That was the solution that they liked, and it fixed it. So there are lots of solutions out there, right? I don't recommend that you tell them solutions, but you could say, here are some options. Personal care attendant, neck brace, blah, 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 blah. And they pick it. And then once they believe that a solution has been identified, then we reevaluate. So we go pick them up and we see what happens. We document all of it, of course, as usual. So there are lots of things, right? Every example we have, it's if this, then that, right? And so it's really important that we try to manage the complying with the ADA, complying with the operational realities for on time, et cetera, that we have, protecting and ensuring the safety of our staff, our drivers, our operators, and of course respecting the rights of the rider. That's what makes public transportation very difficult, is that we really do need to achieve all of that all the time, right? Very important for us to do that. So we only have a few more minutes together. Any other questions? No one asked about service animals. Do you have any service animal issues? Right? How do we determine whether an animal is a service animal? Not how it looks, not even how it acts. Only 2 questions. Is your animal a service animal required because of a disability? And what task has your animal been trained to perform? The difference between a service animal and a pet really comes down to this particular issue. A certain characteristic. The ADA tells us that service animals need to be trained to perform work. That means they need to be trained, right? So it doesn't say professionally trained. FTA is very clear in the 2015 ADA circular that people with disabilities have the right to train their own animals, so be careful.
So I feel like I'm reading correctly when I was looking through the ADA, which defined a service animal as a dog, or...
I'll show you the definition right now. It is a guide dog, signal dog, or other animal. Yes, that literally means any other animal. It does. Right? But
people using those mini ponies or even a llama as service.
we have to ask them, is your animal a service animal required because of a disability? Yes. What task has it been trained to perform? They tell us. It helps them pick up dropped items. That's it. So we worry about abuse of the service animal issue. Yes, there is potential for abuse here, right? But what cannot be abused, if you will, is the requirement for safety. And so from my perspective, do I even care what kind of animal is boarding? From my universal perspective, no, I don't, because I'm focusing on safety. I know of an agency in Arizona that doesn't have a service animal policy. Their policy is animals are welcome, right? And that's, I think, a really kind of helpful. Animals are welcome and they focus on safety. That's an interesting approach, right? So, any other questions? I know we only have a couple more minutes. Anyone here did not get my business card? I know some of you came in a little late. Great question. Thank you. Great question. Yeah, great. There you go. Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course. The last thing I'll leave you with is that, you all have choices, right? You have choices in the services that you provide. You have choices with regards to the type of accommodations you make. You have choices to deny services. When you do, document them very, very well, right? And you also have the ADA guru here to help you. I get emails all the time. This happened. This is how we handled it. What do you think? We have this issue. We're not sure what to do. We're not sure this policy. We just redrafted this policy. Can you read it and let me know what you think? I do lots of that type of assistance, and so it would be a pleasure to help support the work that you are all doing. I do have webinars coming up in October. The ADA compliance requirements webinar addresses every operating requirement, fixed route, and demand responsive services, including like a good solid hour on paratransit. It sounds like there's a lot of paratransit operations here, so it's a great opportunity. We spend, about 4.5 hours, 5 hours, literally going through everything. I mean, I was only able to touch on a handful of issues with you today because we didn't have a lot of time, but there we take our time. So many examples, great conversation. I really recommend that one. And then the creating effective policies. We go through and I use ADA related policies, and we can see how our policies can impact our operation, right? And make things safer, easier, more consistent for our riders and for our own operation, and that's really important as well. So with that, our time is up. I want to thank you so much for being here and for your questions and your attention. And if I can ever be of assistance to any of you, please reach out. It'd be a pleasure to work with you. Thank you very much.